On October 20th, 2011, a man who had ruled Libya for over 4 decades was pulled from a drainage pipe and killed on camera for the world to watch. It was not an accident. It was not a mob losing control. There were people who needed Muammar Gaddafi dead. And the reasons go back much further than the revolution that brought him down. Coming up, who Gaddafi actually was before the world turned against him, and why the timing of his fall was anything but coincidental. To understand why Gaddafi died the way he did, you first have to understand what kind of man he was, and what kind of country Libya had become under him. Muammar Gaddafi was born in 1942 in a tent near the small coastal town of Sirte in the Libyan desert. His family were Bedouin, nomadic herders with no land, no wealth, and no political standing. That origin shaped everything about him. He was an outsider from the very beginning, and he never forgot it. He was educated at the Royal Military Academy in Benghazi, and it was there that he began organizing. Not studying, not socializing, organizing. He formed a secret group of officers who shared his vision, that Libya, still recovering from decades of Italian colonial rule, was being governed by a monarchy that served foreign interests before its own people. On September 1st, 1969, that group acted. In a bloodless coup, 27-year-old Gaddafi overthrew King Idris I while the king was abroad receiving medical treatment in Turkey. The coup was swift, almost surgical. By morning, Libya had a new ruler. In the early years, many Libyans genuinely supported him. He nationalized the foreign-owned oil companies operating in Libya, which had been extracting enormous wealth from Libyan soil, while ordinary Libyans saw almost nothing of it. He expelled the American and British military bases that had operated in the country since the end of World War II. He poured oil revenues into housing, healthcare, and education. Under Gaddafi, Libya went from one of the poorest countries in Africa to the one with the highest human development index on the continent. Those are not propaganda figures. They come from United Nations data. But Gaddafi was not a reformer in the Western democratic sense. He governed through a system he called the Jamahiriya, a term he invented, roughly translating to state of the masses. In practice, it was a system designed to concentrate power while giving the appearance of popular participation. There was no formal parliament. There was no prime minister. Gaddafi held no official title after 1979, referring to himself simply as brother leader or guide of the revolution. And yet every significant decision in Libya ran through him. Political opposition was not tolerated. Those who organized against him faced imprisonment. Those who spoke too openly against the regime from abroad were sometimes tracked down. In 1984, gunmen opened fire from inside the Libyan embassy in London, killing British police officer Yvonne Fletcher, who was monitoring a protest outside. Gaddafi's government denied responsibility, but the international community drew its own conclusions. Through the 1980s, Gaddafi supported armed groups across the world, from the Irish Republican Army to various Palestinian factions to revolutionary movements in sub-Saharan Africa. The United States, under President Ronald Reagan, declared him a state sponsor of terrorism. In April 1986, following a bombing in a West Berlin nightclub that killed 2 American soldiers and was linked to Libyan intelligence, Reagan ordered airstrikes on Tripoli and Benghazi. Gaddafi survived. His adopted daughter did not. Then came the act that sealed his international isolation for over a decade. In December 1988, a Pan Am passenger aircraft exploded over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, killing all 270 people on board. After a lengthy international investigation, the evidence pointed to Libyan intelligence operatives. For years, Gaddafi refused to hand over the accused. International sanctions slowly strangled the Libyan economy. The regime held on, but the pressure was constant. But then, something unexpected happened. Gaddafi came back in from the cold. The West welcomed him. And the reason why tells you everything about what was really at stake when the revolution began. By the early 2000s, Gaddafi made a calculation. After years of sanctions and international isolation, he decided it was more practical to cooperate with the West than to keep fighting it. In 2003, the same year the United States invaded Iraq, Gaddafi announced that Libya would abandon its programs for developing chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. And he invited international inspectors in to verify. It was a significant moment. The Bush administration held it up as proof that diplomacy and military pressure could work hand in hand. The sanctions were lifted, diplomatic relations were restored, European leaders flew to Tripoli. British Prime Minister Tony Blair visited Gaddafi in his famous Bedouin tent in 2004, and the two shook hands in what became one of the most discussed images of that era. Shortly after, BP signed a major contract to explore for oil in Libyan territory. It was not a coincidence. France, Italy, and Germany followed with their own commercial agreements. Libya's oil, among the highest quality crude in the world, flowed more freely than it had in years, and Western corporations were getting their share of it. Gaddafi used the rehabilitation period to rebuild. His son, Saif al-Islam, became the public face of a supposed reform movement, cultivating relationships with Western academics and policy circles. The London School of Economics accepted a substantial donation from a Libyan government-linked foundation. The relationship between Gaddafi's Libya and the Western world was, for a brief period, almost warm. But underneath all of this, something else was developing. Gaddafi had been working on a project that had nothing to do with oil companies or diplomatic meetings. For years, he had been pushing a vision for Africa that was fundamentally at odds with the existing financial architecture of the world. He wanted to introduce a pan-African currency, the gold dinar. The concept was straightforward. African nations would conduct trade among themselves and sell their natural resources, including oil, not in US dollars or euros, but in a currency backed by gold reserves. This was not simply an economic proposal. It was a direct challenge to the existing system in which the dollar functions as the world's reserve currency, giving the United States an enormous structural advantage in global trade and debt financing. Gaddafi had been advocating versions of this idea for years, but by 2009 and 2010, he was pushing it with new urgency inside African Union summits. He reportedly had the support of several African heads of state. The discussions were serious enough that they alarmed financial observers in the West. Libya at that time held approximately 144 tons of gold, one of the largest reserves per capita in Africa. That was the foundation on which a gold-backed currency could have been built. Whether the gold dinar plan directly contributed to the decision to support the uprising against Gaddafi in 2011 is something that Western governments have never officially confirmed. But internal communications from the French Foreign Ministry, reviewed by journalists after they were made public through a legal process in the United States, indicated that France considered Gaddafi's African monetary ambitions a threat to French financial interests on the continent. Interests rooted in the CFA franc system, through which France maintains deep economic influence over its former African colonies. So, when the Arab Spring reached Libya in February 2011, the question was not just whether Gaddafi would fall, it was who would make sure he fell, and how far they were willing to go to guarantee it. The uprising in Libya began in mid-February 2011 in Benghazi, the country's second-largest city, and historically a place of tension with Gaddafi's government. The spark came from the arrest of a human rights lawyer named Fadi Terbil, who represented the families of prisoners killed in the Abu Salim prison massacre of 1996. Protests grew, security forces responded with force, and within days, what had begun as a demonstration became an armed conflict. The situation in Libya was genuinely different from the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt that had preceded it. In those countries, the military eventually declined to fire on the population, and the governments fell relatively quickly. In Libya, loyalist forces were prepared to fight. Gaddafi addressed his supporters and made clear that he intended to crush the rebellion. In one of his speeches during those early weeks, he described those fighting against him in terms that alarmed international observers, promising to pursue them through the streets of Benghazi. That language was cited by Western governments as the justification for what came next. On March 17, 2011, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 1973, authorizing member states to enforce a no-fly zone over Libya and to take all necessary measures to protect civilians. Russia and China abstained rather than vetoing. The resolution passed. Within 2 days, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States had launched military strikes against Libyan air defense systems and ground forces. NATO took over command of the operation shortly after. The stated mission was civilian protection. But what unfolded over the following months went well beyond enforcing a no-fly zone. NATO aircraft struck Gaddafi's ground forces directly. forces that were engaged in fighting rebels, not bombing cities. The alliance became, in effect, the air force of the Libyan rebel movement. The rebels themselves were a complicated coalition. Some were genuinely motivated by the desire for political reform and an end to Gaddafi's authoritarianism. Others came from tribal factions with long-standing grievances against the regime, and among them were armed Islamist groups, including fighters linked to organizations that Western governments had been tracking as security threats before the revolution began. The United States and its allies were aware of this. They chose to proceed regardless. Qatar played a particularly active role, sending weapons, funding, and in some accounts, military advisors, to rebel factions in Libya. This was not a secret within diplomatic circles. Even if it was rarely discussed openly in Western media at the time, the Gulf state had its own reasons for wanting Gaddafi removed, including a long-running personal animosity between Gaddafi and the Qatari royal family that stretched back years and had periodically surfaced in public statements between the two governments. The United Arab Emirates also contributed aircraft to the NATO-led operation. One of the few instances in that conflict where Arab states participated directly in military action against another Arab government. Their involvement gave the campaign a degree of regional legitimacy that Western governments were eager to project, even as the bulk of the military burden was carried by French, British, and American forces. On the ground, the dynamics were shifting. Cities that had been loyalist strongholds began falling. The port city of Misrata, which had endured a prolonged and devastating siege by Gaddafi's forces in the spring of 2011, became one of the most important rebel centers in the west of the country. The fighters who emerged from that siege were among the most battle-hardened in the entire rebel movement, and they carried with them an accumulated fury that would become relevant months later, when the conflict finally reached its end. Through spring and summer, the fighting ground on. NATO carried out more than 26,000 sorties over the course of the campaign, roughly 9,700 of which were strike missions. Gaddafi's forces were slowly degraded. Tripoli fell to rebel forces in August 2011, after an operation that involved significant intelligence coordination with NATO allies. Gaddafi disappeared from the capital and was believed to be moving between loyalist towns in western Libya. He was still alive, still commanding loyalist fighters, and still a problem. And that is precisely where the story takes a turn that most accounts skip over entirely. After Tripoli fell, Gaddafi moved towards Sirte, the coastal city where he had been born and one of the last strongholds of loyalist resistance. His inner circle was shrinking. Many of his commanders had defected, been killed, or fled the country. His son Mutassim remained with him. So did a dwindling force of fighters who were, by this point, encircled by rebel forces backed by continuous NATO air support. The siege of Sirte lasted from mid-September to October 20th, 2011. It was brutal. The city was systematically destroyed by the combination of rebel shelling and NATO airstrikes. Civilian casualties were significant. The fighters inside resisted longer than most observers expected, a reflection of both loyalty and the absence of anywhere else to go. By mid-October, Gaddafi's position was obviously untenable. A convoy of vehicles attempted to break out of Sirte on the morning of October 20th. The convoy was spotted by a NATO surveillance aircraft, a French or American drone, depending on the account, and NATO aircraft struck it repeatedly as it moved along the coastal road. Dozens of people in the convoy were killed in the strikes. The survivors scattered. Gaddafi himself was found hiding in a large concrete drainage pipe near a construction site on the outskirts of Sirte. He was discovered by rebel fighters from Misrata, a city that had suffered enormously during a prolonged loyalist siege earlier in the conflict, and whose fighters had particular reasons to harbor fury toward the man they held responsible. He was pulled from the pipe, still alive. What happened between the moment of capture and the moment of death has been debated, parsed, and investigated many times since. Multiple video recordings exist, shot on mobile phones by the fighters present. They show Gaddafi being dragged, beaten, and handled with extreme violence by the crowd around him. He was bloodied but still alive in the earliest footage. By the time other recordings were made minutes later, he was dead. The official cause of death, as determined by Libyan Transitional Authority medical examiners, was a gunshot wound to the head. No serious investigation ever established exactly who fired the fatal shot, or whether the decision to kill him, rather than capture him, was made in the moment by individual fighters, or was part of a broader understanding among those directing the operation. Human Rights Watch conducted one of the more thorough independent examinations of the circumstances, and concluded that the evidence pointed toward an unlawful killing, that Gaddafi had been alive and in custody when the fatal wound was inflicted. The organization called for a formal investigation. None was carried out by Libyan authorities to any meaningful standard. The International Criminal Court, which had issued an arrest warrant for Gaddafi in June 2011 on charges of crimes against humanity, was not given the opportunity to pursue its case. He never reached The Hague. His body was put on public display in a commercial refrigerator in a shopping center in the city of Misrata for several days, where crowds came to view it. His son, Mutassim, was also killed that same day. Another son, Saif al-Islam, the one who had been the face of Libya's supposed modernization, was captured the following month. He was held in Libya for years, eventually released in 2017 by a faction that had split from the central authority. But the manner of the death, and who benefited from the fact that Gaddafi never spoke in a courtroom, is where this story becomes something more than a chapter in the Arab Spring. When the International Criminal Court issued its arrest warrant for Gaddafi in June 2011, the stated charges related to the ordering of lethal force against civilian protesters in the early weeks of the uprising. The evidence for those charges was real, but a trial in The Hague would have involved more than just those events. A trial would have required the presentation of evidence, cross-examination, and, crucially, the potential testimony of Gaddafi himself. And Gaddafi, whatever his crimes, was a man who had spent 4 decades doing business with governments across Europe, the United States, and the Arab world. He knew where the money had gone. He knew which politicians had accepted it, which intelligence services had cooperated with his security apparatus, and which corporations had profited from arrangements that never appeared in any public filing. The documented history alone was uncomfortable enough. Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi had signed a treaty of friendship with Libya in 2008, which included a formal Italian apology for the colonial era and a pledge of $5 billion in infrastructure investment in Libya over 20 years, in exchange for Libyan cooperation in intercepting migrants crossing the Mediterranean. The two men had a relationship that went back years. When the NATO bombing campaign began, Berlusconi said publicly that he personally opposed it, calling it a betrayal of their relationship. France's relationship with Gaddafi was, if anything, more complicated. Nicolas Sarkozy's 2007 presidential campaign had been the subject of persistent reporting suggesting that Libyan government funds had been channeled toward it, something both Sarkozy and the Libyan government initially denied. In 2018, French judges placed Sarkozy under formal investigation in connection with allegations of illegal campaign financing linked to Gaddafi's government. The investigation was ongoing as of 2024. Sarkozy denied all wrongdoing. Gaddafi had been explicit about what he knew. In the final months before his death, as the military pressure on him intensified, he gave interviews in which he stated that Sarkozy should return the money Libya had provided, framing it as a matter of moral accounting. Those remarks were widely reported at the time, then largely set aside as the statements of a man under siege. But they did not disappear. Beyond the political relationships, there were operational ones. Gaddafi's intelligence services had cooperated with the CIA and MI6 in the years after 2003, including in the identification and transfer of individuals suspected of involvement in Islamist militant networks. Documents discovered in the abandoned offices of Libyan intelligence after Tripoli fell in 2011 showed direct correspondence between Libyan intelligence and Western counterparts, including the facilitation of the return of Libyan dissidents living in the United Kingdom, who were then subjected to harsh interrogation inside Libya. Some of those dissidents later became leaders of the rebel movement that overthrew Gaddafi, which added a particular irony to the situation. The British government eventually acknowledged the substance of some of those claims. In 2018, the British government agreed to pay compensation to one of the individuals involved, Abdel Hakim Belhaj, a man who had gone on to become a prominent military commander within the Libyan rebel coalition. and to his wife after years of legal proceedings. The full scope of that cooperation, however, was never subjected to open judicial scrutiny. None of this would have been comfortable material in an open courtroom. Gaddafi alive and speaking, even from a defendant's dock, would have been a very different problem for a number of governments than Gaddafi dead in a refrigerator in Misrata. And that brings us to what happened in Libya after his death, because the story did not end when Gaddafi did. In many ways, it was only beginning. The National Transitional Council, which had governed rebel-held territory during the conflict, declared Libya's liberation on October 23, 2011, 3 days after Gaddafi's death. Western leaders congratulated the Libyan people. There were expressions of hope that a new democratic Libya would emerge. That did not happen. What followed instead was one of the more consequential and under-discussed disasters of the early 21st century. Libya had no functioning state institutions that could survive the collapse of Gaddafi's system. His Jamahiriya had been deliberately constructed to prevent the emergence of independent political institutions. No independent judiciary, no established civil service, no political parties with real organizational capacity. When the structure fell, there was almost nothing beneath it. The militias that had fought under the rebel umbrella did not disband. They became power centers in their own right, controlling territory, resources, and checkpoints. Some were composed of fighters with genuine nationalist motivations. Others were driven by tribal, regional, or ideological agendas that had little to do with the stated goals of the revolution. The weapons that had been distributed so widely during the conflict, including many from Qatar and other external suppliers, did not disappear when the fighting officially ended. By 2014, Libya had effectively split into competing governments, each backed by different militia coalitions, and, in many cases, different foreign patrons. The United Nations brokered repeated ceasefire agreements, most of which held for weeks before collapsing. The oil infrastructure, the foundation on which any stable Libyan government would have to be built, became a prize fought over by competing factions, with production fluctuating dramatically depending on which group controlled which field or terminal at any given moment. The human cost was enormous and largely invisible to Western audiences. Hundreds of thousands of Libyans were displaced. The open coast of a country with no functioning border enforcement became one of the primary transit points for migrants attempting the dangerous Mediterranean crossing to Europe, a direct consequence of the collapse of the cooperation arrangements that had existed under Gaddafi, including the Italian deal signed in 2008. By the mid-2010s, the death toll among people attempting that crossing had reached catastrophic levels. In 2017, CNN journalists obtained footage from inside Libya showing migrants from sub-Saharan Africa being sold at open-air auctions by armed groups operating in the lawless interior of the country. It was among the most disturbing documentation of what the post-Gaddafi power vacuum had produced. The United Nations described the conditions in Libyan detention centers where migrants were held by militias as amounting to crimes against humanity. The country that had been presented to the world in 2011 as one being liberated from a dictator had, within 6 years, become a place where human beings were being treated as commodities. Libya also became a significant base of operations for armed groups affiliated with the Islamic State, which established a presence in the coastal city of Sirte, the same city where Gaddafi had made his final stand. In 2015, American and British airstrikes were required to dislodge them. The country that NATO had intervened in to protect civilians had become, within 4 years of that intervention, a location requiring further military action to address the consequences of the first. The gold and foreign currency reserves that Libya held at the time of the revolution, billions of dollars worth, including those 144 tons of gold, were frozen by international sanctions and then became subject to complicated and contested legal processes. Much of it remained inaccessible to any Libyan governing authority for years. The United Nations panel of experts on Libya produced annual reports throughout the 2000s documenting arms embargo violations, illegal oil sales, and the financial flows supporting various factions. Those reports named countries, companies, and individuals. They were formally received by the Security Council, discussed briefly, and then filed. No significant accountability followed, which leaves one final and unavoidable question. Not about what Gaddafi was, but about what his death was meant to accomplish, and whether it accomplished it. Muammar Gaddafi was a dictator. That is not a contested statement. Under his rule, people were imprisoned without trial, political opponents were eliminated, and Libya's substantial oil wealth was distributed in ways that served loyalty to the regime more than the consistent welfare of ordinary Libyans. His record in those areas was clear, and no accounting of his death should obscure it. But the history of how he died, and who ensured that he died, is not a simple story of justice catching up with a tyrant. It is a story about the intersection of strategic interests, financial entanglements, and the raw mechanics of how power operates when it decides someone has become more dangerous alive than dead. The NATO intervention was legally authorized by a UN Security Council resolution, but the interpretation of that mandate, from protecting civilians to conducting what amounted to a sustained military campaign to remove a government, stretched far beyond what the resolution's text allowed and was acknowledged as such by Russia and China, who felt the resolution had been used as a pretext. That accusation shaped their approach to subsequent UN deliberations on Syria, with consequences that are still unfolding. The decision not to pursue Gaddafi's capture and transfer to the International Criminal Court was never made formally or publicly. No Western government ever stated that it preferred Gaddafi dead to Gaddafi testifying. But the operational choices made on the ground, the continued NATO strikes on the convoy trying to leave Sirte, the absence of any apparent effort by Allied-backed forces to secure a living prisoner, point in a direction that is difficult to explain purely through chaos and confusion. General Wesley Clark, the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, noted in a widely circulated 2007 interview that he had seen a memo shortly after September 11, 2001, describing a plan to take down 7 countries in 5 years: Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. Libya was on that list a decade before the Arab Spring. Clark's account has been disputed by others within the military and intelligence establishment, and the memo he described has never been independently verified. But the sequence of events that followed, the war in Iraq in 2003, the attempted pressures on Syria and Iran, and the intervention in Libya in 2011, tracked closely enough with that list to keep the question alive. What is not disputed is that France, the United Kingdom, and the United States made choices in the spring and summer of 2011 that went well beyond the stated goal of protecting Libyan civilians, and that those choices resulted in the death of a man who had substantial knowledge of the private dealings of several Western governments. The timing, the method, and the consequences all warrant exactly the kind of scrutiny that a trial in The Hague would have provided, and did not receive. Libya in 2024 remains a country without a unified government, without a functioning national army, and without the institutions that would allow its people to determine their own future through any legitimate political process. The oil still flows, to different buyers, through different arrangements, with the proceeds divided among competing factions and their foreign backers. The people who lived through the revolution, through the civil wars that followed, and through the migrant crisis that engulfed the Mediterranean are still waiting for the stability that the intervention was supposed to help bring about. Gaddafi's death was filmed, shared, and watched by millions of people around the world within hours of it happening. It was visceral and immediate in a way that very few historical events have been. But the footage captured only the final seconds of a story that had been decades in the making. A story involving Cold War politics, oil markets, African monetary policy, intelligence cooperation, alleged campaign financing, and the very particular calculation that sometimes, for some governments, the most dangerous thing a man can do is survive long enough to tell what he knows. The drainage pipe in Sirte ended one chapter. The questions it left behind have not gone away. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.